Hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to make the presentation about the planning and the development of Shanghai from the 1980s. Let me start with some historical backdrop, and let me start with a very brief historical introduction to Shanghai before 1949, when the People's Republic of China was established, and the year marked a significant dividing line in the history of the city. And compared with other Chinese cities, Shanghai is a young city and it has a very short history. And however, Shanghai is probably the most important Chinese history in the modern time because Shanghai has been China's gateway to modernity. Shanghai started with the a colonial origin, and Shanghai was forced to open to foreign trade in 1983 after the Qing Dynasty army was defeated by the British army in the preceding Opium War. And for nearly 1 century, Shanghai was actually a dual city. By a dual city, I mean there was a Chinese Shanghai and there was a foreign Shanghai comprising the foreign concessions, including the French concession and the international settlement of both the British concession and the American concession. This kind of like a colonial and foreign elements were very, very important in the early stage of Shanghai history, and some kind of like legacies are still there. And this photo compelled the bond in the 1930s and today, and we could tell that there are still strong colonial legacies in the city's architecture and urban form. And of course, there are also other non-physical forms of this foreign influences in the city's culture. And so by in the 1920s and 30s, and nearly 1 decade, 1 century after Shanghai was opened to the international trade, Shanghai already grew into international center. It had a population of around 4 million, and even in today's sense, it was a big city. And it was already a world financial and economic center in the Far East. And its built environment and its buildings had the newest architecture expressions using the latest building technology. And all of these achievements put the city in the same rank as London, New York, Chicago, Paris, and Tokyo at the time. So before 1949, Shanghai was a semi-colonial city and by nature a nationalist city. And because the local nationals and the governments and were trying to win over Shanghai from the foreign concessions. And this short history was a glorious and a modern history. And so in any sense, and despite its very short history, and Shanghai was very, very important in modern China. So the post 1949, Shanghai had a different fate and following a different political, social, and economic trajectory from the pre-1949 Shanghai. In much of the 3 decades after 1949, Shanghai was closed to the outside world. Not just Shanghai, but probably the whole mainland China was closed to the outside world under the Mao Zedong's time. And so the whole thing didn't change until 1978 when Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping launched his reform and opening up agenda. However, the Shanghai as we know of it today and experienced one decade in the 1980s. That was what I call the last decade of the 1980s for Shanghai. But that was because the early reform and the opening up was first experimented in Guangdong province. And we all know the miracle of Shenzhen city, a new city and very close to Hong Kong, has rapidly grown from a fishing village or largely rural area into an international metropolis. So the earliest China's opening and reform and economic boom, and they started in Guangdong province. And Shanghai, there was not much happening in Shanghai. And from the chart, we could tell that compare the GDP shares of Shanghai and Guangdong province from 1979 to 1990. We could tell that Guangdong's importance in the national economy was growing, and while the share of Shanghai's was declining, and reflecting the kind of like a shifting roles of the two economic development poles in the country. Why Shanghai was lagging behind? Because in the early stage of China's transformation, and there was political differences between the reformists and the conservatives. And for the conservatives, Shanghai was so important, and they were very cautious about opening Shanghai and to the other side of the world, and they started with Guangdong. So when we talk about Shanghai from the 1980s, and I think this kind of like very short backdrop would be helpful to understand its subsequent development. So Shanghai's rejuvenation started with Pudong, and from the early 1990s. And Pudong is a second Shenzhen, and it is another new city starting from nearly from scratch, because except for some kind of like industrial plexus around the Huangpu River. Pudong literally means the east of the Huangpu River, and it's the Shanghai, or the old Shanghai, as we know, refers to the west of the river. It's called Puxi, literally means the west of the Huangpu River. So the decision of developing Pudong was very strategic in the history of Shanghai, as well as in the contemporary urban transformation of China. So it was the ideas about developing Pudong have been discussed for some time, but the retired Chinese top leader, Deng Xiaoping, without any doubt, played the most strategic role, and he pushed the opening and the development of Pudong, and out of economic consideration, and as well as out of a political consideration, and because in 1989, and there was a sort of like a political crisis happening in Beijing, and the government sent army to clamp down upon the student movement. And so Deng's agenda of reform and opening up was sort of like stagnant, and at the time the political culture was dominated by the conservative thinking against opening and rapid economic development. So Deng used the development of Pudong as a kind of like a political ace card to win over and his battle with the conservatives, more importantly, to bring back his modernization agenda back on track. And Deng had his ally, Zhu Rongji, and the mayor and the party secretary of the Shanghai city at the time. And as we know, Zhu was promoted to the central government later on to oversee the national economic development. So the Pudong development and reoriented and rejuvenated the Shanghai's development from the 1990s on. However, here there are two important themes that are worth noting. That is of the two important themes of developing Pudong, financing and planning, and both themes, both approaches have been heavily influenced by international learning and international learning from Singapore, from Hong Kong. At the time, Hong Kong was not returned back to China, to the mainland yet. So without any doubt, the cultural affinity of the two leading international cities, they played a very important role in supporting and in providing investment, more importantly, in providing expertise and knowledge about the development of Pudong. And also in terms of planning, Pudong also borrowed ideas from many international cities, especially those leading cities, for example, and from Paris, from New York, and from Japan, from Los Angeles. Several important notions have been were borrowed in early 1990s, and they have been incrementally realized in the subsequent 3 decades of the area's development. For example, today we could find those kind of like legacies and imprints of those international notions. For example, the La Défense in Paris, Manhattan and Chicago, and all of those kind of like analogies. We can find them in Pudong today. And so here I would like to draw our attention to the French role in the planning and the design of Pudong. And many of us know that for there was an international design competition held in 1992 for the Pudong CBD. However, I would like to call it the Pudong CBD was the outcome of a Chinese-French plan, because as early as 1987, a plan was proposed for developing the Pudong. That was a collaboration between the Shanghai planners and French experts, and the Shanghai government asked them to revise that plan in 1997. And so that revised 1997 plan, that was the foundation and of the subsequent international design competition. And the French colleagues, experts, and played a very, very important role and in advising, in supporting, and the whole event, because at that time, international planning of such a scale of urban development and how to organize the international design competition, they were all, alien and practices for Shanghai and for China. So the French side provided great support, including knowledge, expertise, and financial support to run the international competition. So even though in marketing of promotion of the Shanghai CBD, and they say that it was an outcome of international design competition. But if we compare the pre-international competition scheme, that was an outcome between the Chinese and the French collaboration, and the final plan scheme for Pudong and in 1993, that was after the international design competition. Some elements and were borrowed from certain schemes from the international competition, but fundamentally we could tell that the final plan of Pudong and was built upon the very original plan for Pudong that was an outcome of French and Chinese collaboration. And the rest is history, as we have observed. And now Pudong is totally different compared with 1990. Okay, three major master plans have been made for Shanghai from 1980s until today. And this was a plan in 1986. This plan was made before the Pudong development, and but some planning and some reform and opening notions, some international notions was started to influence the making of the plan at the time. And this was the 1986 plan, was Shanghai's first statutory master plan endorsed by the central government. And the second major master plan was made in 2001, and 1.5 decades later from the previous version of master plan, Shanghai was largely a different city. So this was a very, this plan was made at the turn of the new century. It set a grand vision of 4 international centers: economic center, financial center, trade center, and the freight center. Those kind of like leading international center notion is still there and guiding Shanghai's strategic development even until today. And the latest master plan of Shanghai was formally endorsed in late 2017, released in early 2018, and this is the latest one, and it is entitled "Striving for the Excellent Global City." Global city is not a new version, a new concept itself, but planners and decision makers in Shanghai highlighted the term "an excellent global city," and meaning that Shanghai is already a global city, and it needs to achieve sort of like excellence and rivaling the counterpart global cities like New York and London and Tokyo and probably even and Paris, and the notions in this plan and has been again under strong international planning diffusion. For example, the concept of global city itself was a notion and learned from overseas. And so this is the latest one, and the whole Shanghai 2030, it's called Shanghai 2035 because the year 2035 is a critical year in so-called new era and of the China's development under the leadership of the current president Xi Jinping. By then, China is going to achieve basic modernization, and Shanghai as its leading gateway city, and without any doubt is expected to play a lead role. So several milestone and projects and of Shanghai in the recent decades, I mean after 1990s, and most of them were based in the new Shanghai, the Pudong, for example, the trio of super high rises, and they were completed in different stages of the city's development. And in 2010, Shanghai held the World Expo, and that was the first expo, and based on the theme of city, and they proposed a slogan of better city and better life. And in 2016, and Shanghai's Disney Resort was opened. All of these iconic projects are regarded as a kind of like representations of the city's rapid growth, and as well as the city's re-rise as a world city or global city. As we just, as I explained in the beginning, Shanghai was already a world financial center, economic center in the early 1920s and 1930s, and 1 century later, and Shanghai simply regained that kind of like world city status. So several takeaways from the observation of the Shanghai's development and the Shanghai's re-rise since 1980s. There was a strong political will linking city making with nation building and modernization. Shanghai's growth is not the growth of about one city, and it's like the growth of Paris. It's not just about the growth of Paris as one city. It's one about the France as a nation. So Shanghai's growth is about the rise of the nation building and the nation's modernization strategy. And clearly there has been a long-termism and strong entrepreneurship, pragmatism, and outcome-oriented strategy. And there we could tell several factors that have played important role, including the globalization and urbanization, and globalization and localization. And without any doubt, the global forces, the foreign direct investment and the foreign expertise, foreign and international diffusion of expertise and international learning, as we just illustrated, and the French know-how, French expertise of urban planning and architecture, and had played very important role in Shanghai's planning and development, including the Pudong, of course, from the 1980s until today. And the last takeaway for me is the timing is right, because Shanghai's right happened to coincide with the accelerated globalization process. So this kind of like both global forces and local forces have joined together to remake the Shanghai as we have observed. So we could tell the China's rapid urbanization and from 1950 to 2050. So at the moment, China's urbanization rate was around a little below 65%. And by the mid of this century, it would reach nearly 80%. So that is highly urbanized society. And reflecting this rapid growth, and on the chart of Shanghai in the global city system that was based on the data of the globalization and the world cities research network based in UK. They measure the global cities in the global system, and by their advanced producer services capacity, and we could tell that in the 21st century, Shanghai's position in the global city system has rapidly increased. And so that's the end of this presentation outlining Shanghai's progress and in urban planning and development since the 1980s. Thank you for your attention.